The old frontier always had its share of wild stories, but none traveled faster than the tale of the Apache man who walked into a burning village, carrying 6 frightened children in his arms. Folks remembered that day because the sky over the desert was thick with smoke. The wind was howling against the cabins, and everyone believed the fire would swallow the whole place before sundown. Yet out of all the chaos, out of all the fear, it was a lone Apache warrior named Tenok who stepped through the flames with those little ones clinging to him. Some were crying, some shaking, and one held on to his braided hair like it was the only thing keeping him alive. People could not forget that sight, even if they tried. Tenok had always lived on the edges of the desert, keeping to himself and raising the 6 children, who were not his by blood, yet he guarded them stronger than any man guarded his own. Some said he had taken them in after a raid years back. Others whispered he had found them wandering in the canyon after losing their families. No one really knew, and Tenok never spoke about it. What mattered was that those children followed him like shadows, trusted him with everything, and slept each night wrapped beneath the same animal hide blanket he had stitched for them. When he saved the village, the townsfolk finally looked at him with new eyes. Before that day, many had kept their distance, unsure of the tall warrior with the broad shoulders, long black hair, and quiet stare that could make even the toughest ranch hand shift in place. But after the fire, after seeing him risk his life for people who had often turned their backs on his kind, they felt a guilt they could not hide. So the council gathered and said they would offer him something meaningful, something that showed they were grateful and wanted peace. They walked him up the dry hill by the river bend and pointed to a small wooden cabin standing crooked on its posts. The roof sagged on one side, the door hung uneven, and the entire place leaned so far to the left it looked ready to fall to the ground by sunrise. Still, the council leader, a stern man named Grover Hale, spoke with pride. He said it had once belonged to an old trapper who vanished during winter, and no one had bothered to claim it since. Most saw the cabin as a burden, a broken thing not worth fixing. But to the council it was perfect, because it was far enough from the rest of the village to keep folks comfortable and close enough that no one could accuse them of offering nothing. Tenok stood there with the wind pushing against his back, his 6 children standing in a row like small soldiers beside him, and he listened without saying a word. But anyone watching him closely would have noticed the slight furrow in his brow when he first looked at the cabin. It leaned too sharply for natural wear, and the ground beneath it looked disturbed, as if someone had dug there in past years. He felt a pull in his stomach, not fear, but something sharper. The children, however, were hopeful. One of the girls, a small child named Naira, with hair down to her waist, tugged on his hand and whispered that she liked the place. She said it looked funny in a kind way and that maybe if they fixed the roof they could plant flowers near the door. Tenok gave her a faint smile, though his eyes stayed locked on the crooked frame. The village clapped and celebrated, believing they had done the right thing. They walked back down the hill feeling proud of themselves, leaving Tenok and the children alone with the gift no one wanted. As the sun dipped low, turning the sand a deep copper color, Tenok stepped closer to inspect the cabin. The wood had splintered in places and the inside looked darker than it should have. There was a smell too, not rotten, but old in a strange way, like something had been sealed away for far longer than any of them could understand. He touched one of the wall planks, and it shifted under his fingers, as if hollow. The 6 children gathered around him, their small faces expectant. They trusted his judgment more than they trusted the world, and the weight of that trust sat heavy on his broad shoulders. He pushed the uneven door open, and it scraped the dry ground with a harsh drag. The room inside was warmer than the air outside, almost too warm. Dust floated in slow swirls, catching the last of the sunlight that pushed through the crooked window. Everything was empty except a single stool in the corner, and the marks of old boot prints pressed into the wooden floor. Tenok stepped inside, and the cabin gave a long groan. The children hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether the sound was harmless or a warning. The youngest boy, Hakan, reached for Tenok's leg and asked if it would fall on them. Tenok rested his hand on the boy's head and said it would stand long enough for them to know if it was safe. But his voice lacked the calm he usually carried. He felt something else in that space, something he could not name, as he crouched near the tilted wall. He spotted a faint carving in the wood. It was thin, scratched deeply, almost hidden in the shadows. He brushed the dust aside, and the carving revealed a symbol he had only seen once before in his life. A mark belonging to a man who should not have been anywhere near this village, a man whose presence always brought trouble. The kind of trouble that stained the land long after he left. Tenok froze for a moment. His heartbeat thumped heavy in his ears. He had hoped the past would never circle back to him, not for his own sake, but for the 6 little ones who relied on him for everything. If that mark was real, if it truly belonged to the man he feared it did, then this cabin was not a gift. It was a sign. A warning. Or worse, a trap that had been waiting for him to walk into it. A cool wind swept through the doorway, brushing past the children and into the dark room. The leaning cabin creaked again, louder this time, almost like it was speaking or remembering something buried beneath it. The 6 children stepped closer, sensing the shift in Tenok's posture. They looked at him with wide eyes, waiting for him to say something. Anything that would ease the strange feeling rising in their chests. But Tenok only stared at the carving, his jaw tightening, his breath slowing. In that moment, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The cabin was leaning for a reason, and whatever caused it had nothing to do with time or weather. It was something hidden, something buried, something left behind with purpose. And as the last ray of sun slid behind the desert ridge, Tenok realized that accepting this cabin had placed all of them on the edge of a danger far greater than the fire. He had saved the village from... The truth was waiting beneath the floorboards, waiting in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. And once found, it might change everything about their lives forever. He reached for the children, guiding them back from the doorway. But before he could speak, a sharp sound came from inside the cabin. Not the wind, not the wood. Something else, something that should not have been there. And the cabin leaned. Just a little farther, the sound inside the crooked cabin echoed in the still desert air, sharp enough to stop every breath around it. Tenok held an arm out to keep the children behind him as his eyes narrowed toward the dark space beyond the uneven doorway. For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the dust, not the door, not even the warm breeze slipping across the open ground. The children watched him with wide, unsure eyes, their small hands clutching each other for strength. They trusted him more than the world. But even they could feel that something inside the cabin was wrong. Tenok stepped back and slowly closed the door. The dry wood scraped the ground once again, but this time the sound seemed heavier somehow. He told the children they were heading back to the small camp. They had set up under the mesquite trees until they could decide what to do. The oldest boy, Aramis, looked back at the leaning cabin with steady eyes. Aramis rarely spoke unless necessary, but even he did not hide the unease on his face. The others followed silently, glancing over their shoulders as they walked. And the setting sun painted their shadows long across the dirt. Tenok kept them close, guiding them down the slope until they reached the fire pit they had built earlier that day. He lit a small flame and let the children sit around the warmth. They huddled near the sparks, whispering among themselves about the cabin and whether something was inside. Tenok listened without interrupting. He wanted to hear what they felt because children sensed danger in ways adults sometimes forgot. Hakan said he thought the cabin was breathing. Naira insisted she saw the window move on its own. The smallest one, little Keone, said she heard someone calling from underneath the floor. Tenok's jaw tightened a bit, though he relaxed his shoulders when they looked at him. He spoke gently, telling them they would learn the truth in time, but not tonight. He looked up at the leaning structure on the hill, a dark outline against the purple sky. It stood crooked and silent, but Tenok knew the desert often held secrets, and none of them stayed buried forever as the fire crackled. The children ate the small meal he prepared for them. It was nothing more than roasted corn and dried meat, but it was warm and safe, and that was enough for now. Their tired bodies began to relax as the night air cooled. Tenok watched each of them carefully. They had all lived through hardship before. They had seen things children should never see, survived storms and hunger, and followed him through places many grown men feared to walk. Yet tonight their eyes carried something heavier, something deeper. and he knew the cabin had stirred memories they did not speak of. Long after the children drifted to sleep beneath their blanket, Tenok rose quietly and stepped away from the camp. He stood, with his back to the fire, facing the crooked cabin on the hill. The moon had risen full and bright, giving the leaning walls a strange glow. He felt the past pulling at him, urging him to remember what he had tried to leave behind. The carving in the wall, the symbol etched deep inside the cabin, had belonged to a man named Riddle, a man Tenok had once crossed paths with during a bitter winter near the Painted Gorge. Riddle was not a man of peace. He was the kind who moved like a storm, taking what he wanted, leaving chaos behind. Tenok had encountered him years ago when traveling with the children through a ravine. Back then, he had only 3 of them. The other 3 came later, rescued during separate tragedies. But the first time he met Riddle, the man had been tracking someone through the frozen canyon. He had spoken little, but his voice carried a cruelty that left the air colder. Tenok had sensed danger instantly and kept the children hidden behind him. Riddle never struck, never drew a knife or gun, but his eyes had carried an emptiness Tenok would never forget. Days later, Tenok discovered that the man had been searching for a cabin of his own, one rumored to hide something valuable. The rumor alone had drawn desperate men from across the frontier. Some believed it held stolen gold. Others whispered it contained a map leading to river stones worth more than silver. But Tenok knew better. Whatever Riddle hunted, it was not gold or stones. The man moved like someone searching for a memory he could not escape. A memory twisted enough to make him dangerous. Tenok hoped he would never see that symbol again. Yet there it was, carved deep inside the crooked cabin gifted by the village. A gift meant to show gratitude had somehow tied him back to the one man he hoped had disappeared forever. He spent the night thinking, mind moving through old trails and hidden warnings. At dawn, he walked the children to the river so they could wash and cool their faces. The morning was warm, and the desert shimmered with early light. The children splashed one another, laughing in a way that eased the weight on his chest. He wanted them to have a place to call home, a place where they could sleep without fear. He had thought the cabin might be that place if repaired, but now he wondered whether it held something meant for someone else. Something dangerous. Aramis walked up beside him and stood with quiet strength. He always stood like that, tall for his age, watching the world with a steadiness beyond his years. He asked Tenok if they would live in the cabin. Tenok answered honestly, saying they could not decide until they understood why it leaned so sharply. Aramis nodded slowly, never pushing for more answers. He trusted Tenok fully, but he also knew when danger was close. His eyes kept drifting back to the hill. Later that day, Tenok took the children into the village so they could trade for supplies. People greeted them warmly at first, grateful for the life Tenok had saved. They offered smiles, bread, blankets, and handshakes. Mothers thanked him, fathers clapped his shoulder, and some children waved as the group passed by. For a moment it felt like everything would be fine. But then a few townsfolk began whispering. They watched the 6 little ones closely, counting each one as if the number mattered more than their faces. Someone mentioned the old trapper who had once lived in that crooked cabin. They said he had left in a hurry one night, muttering about strange noises coming from under the floor. Another villager, a woman named Miriam, lowered her voice and said the cabin had leaned more every season, even though no storms had struck that hill. She swore that one time, while gathering herbs, she heard something scratching from beneath it. Tenok kept his face calm, but inside he felt the tension twisting tighter. He thanked the villagers and headed back with the children. Their small hands were full of the things people had gifted them, but their eyes were fixed on him. Sensing the weight behind his silence, when they reached the camp, Tenok felt something wrong before they even saw it. The air was still, too still. The fire pit was as they left it, but the edges of their blanket had been disturbed, not by wind, not by animals. Something had stepped there, something with purpose. Aramis noticed it too, and crouched beside the prints in the dirt. They were faint but clear enough. Not human, not animal. A strange shape, almost like someone dragging something heavy. The children drew closer, uneasy. Tenok placed himself between them and the tracks. He scanned the open desert, the hills, the mesquite trees, but nothing moved. The sky was wide, the land empty. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed on him. He looked straight toward the crooked cabin. The sun hit the leaning wall in a way that made the old boards shimmer. A long shadow stretched from beneath it, darker than any other. Tanakh understood then that whatever was under that cabin had not remained still last night. It had moved. It had come closer, and now it waited for him to come back. Tanakh told the children to stay behind him as they prepared to walk up the slope. Once again. Their small footsteps hesitated, but they followed because they always followed him. The desert wind blew across their faces, carrying a faint sound in the distance. A low hum like something deep beneath the earth stirring. The cabin stood crooked and silent. It shadowed longer than before, almost reaching the trail where Tanakh walked, and as they reached the base of the hill, the ground beneath their feet trembled for one brief second, as if something under the cabin shifted again. Waiting for the moment they stepped inside, the ground's faint tremble passed as quickly as it came, but it left a quiet fear in the children's eyes. Tanakh felt it too, that strange shift in the earth beneath the crooked cabin. He had walked desert lands long enough to know natural movements from unnatural ones. And what he felt now did not belong to the land. It belonged to something hidden within it, or beneath it. Still, he kept moving, each step steady as he led the children up the hill. The dry grass brushed their legs, and the hot wind pushed against their backs, as if urging them not to go farther. But Tanakh pressed on. Aramis walked closest to him, his jaw tight and his hands curled into fists. He watched the ground more than the cabin, studying the dirt and broken rocks for any sign of the dragging tracks they had found near the camp. He saw none on the slope. Whatever had wandered near them earlier had not come from this trail, which made the mystery sharper. The other children followed in pairs, whispering to each other in soft, worried tones they tried to hide. Keone kept holding on to Naira's shirt, refusing to let go. When they reached the top of the hill, the crooked cabin loomed larger. The way it leaned was unsettling, almost like it bent on purpose, as if listening. The long shadow beneath it stretched deep into the sand, darker than a normal shadow should be under morning light. Tanakh stopped a few feet away, his hand raised in warning. The cabin made a slow, creaking sound, even though no wind touched it now. It stood there, an old structure abandoned by its owner. Yet it felt alive. Tanakh crouched down, touching the earth with 2 fingers. The ground was cool, strange for the warming day. He brushed aside a thin layer of sand and found marks beneath it. Not prints. Not dig signs, lines, long straight lines carved deep into the hardened earth. They formed no clear pattern, but they were not made by animals or weather. Some lines curved into circles. Others crossed sharply like warnings. Tanakh covered them again and stood slowly. He told Aramis to keep the children behind him. Aramis nodded, stepping in front of the others, his stance wide and protective. Tanakh approached the cabin alone. The door remained closed, yet it looked as if it had shifted since yesterday. The bottom corner sat deeper in the dirt. He pressed his palm against the wood. It felt warm. Not sun-warm. Something else. He pushed the door open, and the soft scrape broke the silence. The interior looked the same as the night before, except for the stool in the corner. It lay on its side now. Tanakh was certain it had been upright when he first entered. Dust danced in the sunlight, and a low sound, almost like breathing, drifted from somewhere beneath the floor. The children stayed outside, their feet planted firmly in the dust. They could feel the darkness inside pull at their nerves. Aramis took a step closer, but Tanakh lifted a hand and shook his head. The boy stopped immediately. Tanakh scanned the room. He walked toward the tilted wall where he had found the carving. The strange marks still glared back at him, and for a moment he could almost hear the voice of Riddle echo through memory. A dry voice, low and steady, telling him the desert kept things buried until they chose to rise again. Tanakh had never taken his words seriously back then, believing them to be the ramblings of a restless man. But now the memory pressed on him like a heavy stone. He knelt near the floorboards, touching the wood gently. One of the boards felt loose. He pushed against it, and it shifted slightly. Something had moved under there. Recently, the thought chilled him. The cabin had been empty for years. Nothing should be beneath its floor except sand, beetles, and old air. Yet the board was loose, and the sound he had heard earlier came from below. Tenok backed away and stepped outside. He knew he could not pry open the floor with the children standing nearby. Whatever was hidden under the cabin had waited for years. It could wait a little longer. His first duty was to keep the 6 little ones safe. He told Aramis that they would return to the village for the rest of the day. The children did not argue. They walked down the hill quickly, rarely looking back at the crooked structure. Even the smallest felt the cabin's weight like a storm cloud, and no one wanted to linger near it. Once in the village, Tenok brought the children to the trading post. The old owner, Brinton Hale, brother of Grover, greeted them warmly. His voice was rough from years behind dusty counters, but he always had a soft spot for children. He gave each of them a small sweet made from honey and grain, smiling as the little one's eyes brightened, as the children explored the shelves. Brinton leaned in close to Tenok and lowered his voice. He asked if Tenok had slept in the cabin yet. Tenok told him no. Something in Brinton's expression shifted. He looked uneasy, rubbing his thumb along the counter. Brinton said he remembered the old trapper who lived there. The trapper's name was Rourke, a man with long, quiet nights and restless days. He never spoke much, but once, after drinking too much. He told Brinton that the cabin leaned because something under the ground pushed upward. Rourke claimed he heard knocking at night, like someone or something wanted out. Most folks chalked it up to wind or Rourke's imagination. But the man had left the next winter, abandoning everything. Brinton said he never even took his boots. He just walked barefoot into the desert and never returned. Tenok listened silently. Brinton hesitated again before adding that he had once seen Rourke speaking with a stranger outside the cabin. A tall man with a coat too heavy for summer. A man with cold eyes and a slow voice. Tenok knew immediately that it was Riddle. The truth struck him like a hammer. Riddle had been here long before Tenok ever arrived. The children came running back with small trinkets in their hands. Pulling Tenok's attention away, he gave Brinton a final nod, then led the children out. The warm sun did little to ease the cold coil in his chest. He needed to know what Riddle was looking for, and why that symbol was carved inside the cabin. They spent the afternoon gathering supplies and helping a few villagers repair fences and wells. This kept the children busy and eased their minds for a time. But Tenok could feel something watching them. Every now and then he sensed eyes on his back. When he turned, no one was there, yet the feeling stayed. As evening drew close, Tenok led the children back to their camp. The wind carried a strange scent, like wet earth, though it hadn't rained in weeks. The children walked slower, glancing toward the hill. The crooked cabin stood against the horizon like a bent skeleton. When they reached the camp, Tenok stopped sharply. The dragging marks they had seen earlier were now deeper, fresh. Something had returned while they were gone. Aramis crouched beside the tracks again, his face hardening. He said the marks were heavier now, as if whatever made them had grown stronger or more bold. Tenok nodded. They needed answers. He told the children to stay near the fire as he walked toward the hill alone. Aramis tried to follow, but Tenok shook his head. This was something he could not risk anyone else facing. The sky darkened as he approached the crooked cabin again. The leaning walls creaked, and the air grew colder with every step. He could hear the children behind him talking softly, their voices trembling. Tenok reached the door and placed his hand on it. The wood pulsed faintly under his palm as if the cabin itself was breathing. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the loose floorboard had been lifted. Just a finger's width, but enough. Tenok stepped inside. The air was thick, warm, and strangely still. He crouched beside the lifted board, gripping its edge, and from beneath the floor, a faint whisper rose. Not wind, not memory. A real whisper. Something alive was waiting under the cabin, something connected to Riddle, something that had been buried for years and was now waking. Tenok's breath steadied as he tightened his grip on the board, knowing the moment he lifted it, he would come face to face with the truth he had spent years trying to outrun. The cabin leaned again. Slower this time, like it bowed toward him, urging him to open the floor, and behind him. Far down the hill, the 6 children stood frozen, watching their protector kneel over the darkness that might change everything they knew about their past, their future, and the secret beneath the crooked cabin that refused to stay hidden. The lifted floorboards sat uneven beneath Tenek's hand as the desert wind outside seemed to hold its breath. The children waited far down the hill, their small figures standing in a tight cluster, afraid to move or call out his name. Tenek could feel their worry like a weight pressing against his spine, but he did not turn back. Whatever waited under the crooked cabin had been there long before the children came into his life, long before the village ever stood here. And now that it had stirred, he knew running from it would no longer keep them safe. The whisper rose again from the darkness below. Too faint to understand, yet impossible to ignore. It slid through the boards like smoke, brushing the edges of Tenek's mind with a cold heaviness. He leaned close, listening carefully. No human voice sounded like that. It was low, disjointed, almost like several voices tangled together. The air thickened, warmer than the night should allow, and the wood under his palm throbbed as if something pushed against it from beneath. Tenek inhaled slowly. His heart stayed steady, trained by years of hardship and danger, but his muscles tensed with instinct. If he was going to lift that board, he needed to be ready for anything that surfaced. He reached for his knife, the same one he had carried since the day he rescued the first of the 6 children. The smooth bone handle fit easily into his grip. Whatever waited below would not catch him unprepared. A soft thump echoed through the floor, then another. The cabin leaned slightly forward as if drawn toward the noise. Dust fell from the rafters. The walls groaned. The sound built, growing stronger and sharper, until something scraped the underside of the wood like nails dragging over old timber. Tenek tightened his hold on the knife and lifted the board an inch. Warm air rushed out, heavy and stale. It smelled like old soil and rusted metal. Beneath the opening stretched a dark crawl space deeper than the foundation should allow. The faint sound rose again. Not a whisper this time. A slow pulsing hum, like a heartbeat far underground. He lowered the board back down, pressing it shut. Not out of fear, but strategy. If he opened it fully without knowing what lay beneath, he might endanger the children. He needed to gather more knowledge, search for clues. Understand the mark carved into the wall, and the reason Riddle had come here before him. He stepped out of the cabin and let the door fall closed. The wood made a hollow thud. Even from outside, the children felt the shift in the air. Aramis ran toward him first, the others closed behind. Their faces were pale, their voices small. They asked him what he found, what made the cabin shake, why the ground trembled. Tenek did not give them false comfort. He told them the truth in simple words. Something lived under the cabin, something that had been buried for years. The children huddled closer, and even Aramis could not hide. The way his breath hitched. Tenek placed a strong hand on the boy's shoulder and told him not to fear. He had faced worse in his life and had survived each time because he protected the ones beside him. The children listened, and though shadows remained in their eyes, their shoulders eased just enough for them to breathe. They returned to their camp, but sleep did not come easily that night. The desert was quiet in a strange way, as if every creature sensed the disturbance within the hill. The usual rustling of night insects faded. The wind barely stirred. Even the fire seemed to burn lower, flickering with a nervous light. Tenek sat awake, watching the crooked cabin from afar. The cabin leaned slightly more now. The shift was small, but noticeable. Something beneath it was pushing upward with growing strength. He wondered if the village leaders truly had no idea. If they believed they were giving him an empty cabin, why had they not repaired it long ago? Why leave it untouched? Why call it a gift if it held a hidden burden? Hours passed before he noticed a faint glimmer near the cabin. A small light, then another. Tiny sparks, soft and flickering like fireflies. Except no fireflies lived in this part of the desert. The sparks drifted near the ground, circling the cabin slowly, almost like they were searching for something or guarding something. Tenek's jaw tightened. This was no ordinary cabin. and no ordinary shadow buried beneath it. The next morning, he took the children to the village again. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The villagers greeted them warmly at first, but when Tanakh asked direct questions about Rourke the Trapper, about the cabin's history, about strange events, their smiles faded. Some avoided his gaze. Others walked away with quick excuses. Only one woman, Miriam, spoke freely. She admitted she had once heard crying from the cabin long after Rourke disappeared. Not a man's cry. Not a child's. Something in between, muffled and distant. She also remembered that the land beneath the cabin had once been a burial place, long before settlers founded the village. But no one knew who had been buried there or why the markers were gone. Tanakh thanked her and gathered the children. He sensed watchful eyes again. A few villagers whispered behind their hands. He caught one phrase, something about the cabin choosing its owner, another about curses, more talk about Rourke losing his mind. The tension thickened as they walked away. The village was grateful to Tanakh for saving them, but fear always reshaped gratitude. Some villagers wondered if giving him the cabin had been a mistake. Others wondered if the strange noises or shifting ground would bring danger. Fear spread quietly. Tanakh could feel it like heat from a fire. On their way back to camp, Aramis asked why the villagers feared the cabin so much. Tanakh answered simply, "People fear what they do not understand." Aramis nodded, though not fully convinced. His young mind had seen too much already. He sensed this fear was not ordinary. As they neared the camp, Tanakh stopped suddenly. The dragging tracks from the day before were deeper and longer. They circled the camp in a wide arc, then disappeared toward the hill. Something had moved close again while they were gone. Something curious or restless. Tanakh knew they could not wait any longer. The truth needed to be confronted before it grew more dangerous. He gathered the children, told them they would stay a safe distance away while he inspected the cabin more thoroughly. They looked terrified but trusted him. He approached the crooked cabin once more. The air around it felt heavier. The leaning structure cast a darker shadow, one that seemed to stretch farther than any natural shadow should. The wind brushed past him with a strange chill. He stepped inside. The loose floorboard lay slightly higher than before, and the hum beneath the cabin had grown louder. She lifted the board slowly this time. The warm air rushed out again, pushing against him like a warning. Beneath lay a deep pit, much larger than any foundation hole should be. The space dropped downward into darkness, but faint glowing specks pulsed inside. Scattered like embers floating in a hidden pocket of the earth, Tanakh leaned closer, gripping the edges tightly as he fought the pull of curiosity and caution. The once faint whisper now rose clearly, forming broken words that scraped against the walls like wind trapped in stone. He could not understand the voice, but he could feel the meaning calling, waiting, expecting him. The glow beneath intensified. Something shifted. Something rose, and just as Tanakh steadied himself, ready to face whatever emerged from the pit, the ground trembled harder than ever, shaking the entire cabin. The walls groaned. The door swung open. Dust exploded into the air. Down the hill. The 6 children screamed his name as the crooked cabin leaned farther than ever before, tilting so sharply that it looked ready to collapse into the earth and expose the secret beneath it forever. The cabin tipped so sharply that, for a moment, Tanakh believed it might topple completely. Dust burst through the cracks. Wooden beams groaned, and the floor rolled beneath him like the ground was alive. He steadied himself as the glowing specks beneath the lifted board pulsed brighter, rising in swirling ribbons of warm light. The children at the bottom of the hill called out, but their voices came like distant echoes over the rumbling wooden frame. Tanakh gripped the open and looked into the pit. Something moved again, but this time it was not frightening. The glow softened, warming the air like sunlight rising in early dawn. The strange whisper became a gentle breath, filled not with danger, but with longing. As if some old story trapped in the earth wanted to take shape one last time, Tanakh lowered himself to one knee and leaned closer. He could see outlines forming in the light, not sharp like a person or creature, but soft and wavering. A shape that felt familiar, even though he had never seen it before. The cabin steadied as if the force rising beneath it no longer meant to break through, but to reveal itself slowly. A voice rose from the pit. Not threatening, not broken. A voice filled with quiet sorrow. It whispered a name Tanakh had heard only once in his life. A name Riddle had spoken years ago during that cold winter in the Painted Gorge. The name of the one person Riddle had loved but could never save. Tanakh felt his chest tighten. The shape in the glowing light shifted again. A woman's silhouette appeared, her form faint like a shadow trapped in a warm breeze. Her voice trembled with gratitude. She had been buried here, not by the villagers, but by Riddle himself. He had hidden her beneath the cabin to protect her memory from the men who hunted him and everything he cared for. The lines carved into the dirt outside were her resting place. The faint sparks that drifted around the cabin were remnants of her spirit. Trying to break free for years, Tanakh understood then why the cabin leaned. It was not haunted by something evil. It was pulled by a love that had never rested, a heart that had never found peace. The glow brightened, swirling up toward the tilted roof. Tanakh stood slowly, watching the light fill the room like dawn breaking open. He felt no fear, only calm. The cabin shifted back in place with a long creak that sounded almost relieved. The ground settled beneath his feet. The children stopped shouting and stared up at the hill with wide eyes as the glow leaked softly through the cracks of the cabin. Tanakh spoke gently to the spirit, promising her that her name would not be forgotten. He said he would carry her memory forward in his own way, and he thanked her for revealing the truth instead of leaving the cabin to crumble under secrets and grief. The glowing shape paused, then slowly drifted higher. With each passing second, it grew dimmer, until the last of the light broke through the roof's edge and rose into the open sky. The room became still again, warm, peaceful. Tanakh lowered the floorboard, placing it back gently. The hum beneath the wood faded, leaving behind a soft quiet that filled the entire cabin. He stepped outside to the children, who ran toward him with worry and relief mixed on their faces. They clung to his arms and waist, asking what happened, what that light was, whether he was hurt. He knelt in the sand, pulling all 6 of them into a strong embrace. He told them the truth in a way they could understand. A story of love, loss, and release. A story that belonged to the land long before the village existed. When he finished, the children looked up at the cabin with new eyes. The fear that once clouded their faces softened. Even Aramis, who rarely showed emotion, let his shoulders relax. Naira whispered that the cabin was not crooked anymore. She was right. The lean had straightened. It stood firm and steady on the hill, as if a heavy weight had lifted from the earth beneath it. Tanakh decided they would live in the cabin now that the secret under it had finally been freed. The villagers, upon hearing the truth, gathered supplies and helped repair what remained broken. They brought new planks, fresh nails, and strong beams for support. Brinton Hale carried tools with a determined smile, saying that if Tanakh was willing to accept the cabin, then the village would honor him with real work this time. Not a broken gift. For days the sound of hammers and laughter filled the hill. Miriam brought blankets sewn by her own hands. Children from the village came to play with Tanakh's 6 little ones. Running through the dust and chasing each other around the newly fixed porch, Tanakh watched from the doorway, his heart steady and warm. The cabin no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a beginning at night, when the desert wrapped itself in cool air. Tanakh sat by the fire with the children gathered around him. They slept easily now, their breaths soft and steady. The heaviness that once shadowed them was gone. Tanakh looked at the hilltop where faint sparks sometimes drifted, not of fear but of memory, a gentle reminder that the desert carried its own quiet stories. But not all of them were dark. Aramis eventually asked why Riddle had buried the woman there, why he had chosen such a lonely place. Tanakh answered that some men carry pain they cannot set down, and some loves remain stronger than fear. Riddle had tried to protect her the only way he knew. The mistakes he made afterward had been the result of grief he never learned to mend. But now her spirit was free, and perhaps somewhere, Riddle's restless wandering had stilled as well. As the weeks passed, the cabin turned into a warm home. The children planted flowers beside the doorway just as Naira once imagined. A small garden grew behind the cabin, watered with care each morning. The crooked place that once frightened them now held laughter and peace. It stood strong against the sky, no longer leaning, no longer hiding anything beneath it. The villagers began visiting often, bringing food, tools, and news from the town. They treated the 6 children as their own, offering lessons, games, and companionship. Tenok watched this with gratitude. He had spent years wandering, always moving to protect the children from shadows that followed him. But now, for the first time, they had a place to belong. A place that no longer held secrets that threatened them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in gold, Tenok stood outside the cabin and watched the horizon glow. The land stretched far and wide, full of old stories, new beginnings, and quiet peace. The children played nearby, their laughter echoing across the open valley. Aramis had built a small wooden horse for Kione. Hakan and Naira chased each other around the fence. Even the shyest of them, little Laya, picked flowers from the garden with a gentle smile. Tenok felt the desert settle around him, no longer heavy with unanswered questions. The cabin behind him stood tall and steady, its roof shining under the last light. The fear and tension that once held the land had faded into memory. What remained was a home built on courage, truth, and the quiet strength of family. The cabin had once been crooked because it carried a burden. Now it stood straight because the burden was gone. Tenok looked at the children, the land, and the sky above them. He had walked long roads full of danger and doubt, but they had led him here, to a place where he and the 6 little ones could finally rest. The mystery beneath the cabin had brought fear, but it had also brought clarity. Some truths rise only when they are ready, and some homes become strong only after their secrets are set free. As night settled and the stars brightened, Tenok called the children inside. They gathered around the warm fire, their faces lit with peace. Outside, the desert hummed softly, carrying the sound of a land healed at last, and for the first time in many years. Tenok knew their story was not ending. It was only beginning in a cabin that once leaned, but now stood firm, a gift not of fear, but of hope, and a reminder that even the most hidden stories can lead to a new and happy life.